Grimgar of Fantasy and Ash is a fantasy isekai light novel written by Ao Jumonji. This is my optimistic and spoiler-free review of Volume 1 as translated by J Novel Club. Out of all the books that I've read in recent times, Grimgar is easily the one that surprised me the most. Not in the sense of things like plot twists and things that actually happen in the series which are surprising, but in the sense that I was going into the series expecting things like really strong game aesthetic, RPG aesthetic, and that's not at all what the book is really about. The book is all about the characters. Sure, there is combat, and there is a fair amount of combat, but even in the combat, there's character conflict and things going on, and everything is decided based on the characters. And as I was going through the first volume, I did think, did I really want to read this? And I'd got to the end of the book and I wanted to read the next one. So I thought, I went into the series wanting all this kind of RPG stuff, but by the end I was like, well, I actually really enjoy all this character interaction. That all being said, this isn't just some soap opera school drama of a book. This is not a soft book in the slightest either, so going in expecting some kind of combat and some hardship, you're going in and you're really getting some really harsh stuff going on, and the way the characters talk are really harsh. And that leads me to the first downside of the book, which is that at the start, the characters don't know what's going on, they don't know what to do, and they're in this place and they're going to struggle to survive. But by the end, all that kind of goes away, like apart from, the actual combat and stuff, the rest of the world doesn't really provide any difficulties there for them anymore. So all the difficulties from then on are solely about the character conflict and all the combat. And one slight problem with this is that because they take away so much from learning about the environment, you don't really get too much knowledge about the world because it's all about the characters and the conversations they have. Unless they very specifically talk to someone about something in the world, you're never hearing anything about the rest of the world, only about where they are and what exactly these characters are doing. And for the most part, you're only really getting one viewpoint for the whole book, and that's from the character of Haruhiro. And along with this kind of like 95% of the viewpoint coming from him, pretty much 95% of all conversation is dominated by one character, which is called Ranter. And I'd rant a whole lot about this character, but in reality, this character is supposed to fit a very kind of Japanese comedic style, which if you do like, then that's fine. If you don't, then he does take up a lot of conversation. I don't particularly like the character and the way that he dominates the conversation. In terms of the actual comedy, I don't really find it that funny or anything, but I understand that this character is very unique and he plays a very specific role in the book and in the series as a whole. The one problem with this that you'll find is that all the characters, not even just in the party, but every single character you come across is completely unique. And based on things that happen in the book and series, that's what the kind of book has to do. It has to make every character unique. And because of this, when a situation comes up, you can almost tell who's going to do what, and that kind of takes away from some of the conversations which do happen. So I've talked a whole bunch about the conversations and the characters, but there's a whole other part to the book, which is the combat. So even though I've banged on about the character conflict conversations, the action sequences are exceedingly long in this book. And this is because you get so much dialogue even in the combat sequences. And when I say dialogue, a lot of it is actually Haruhiro's internal thoughts that you get a lot of. And it's interesting because the only difference really between conversation outside of combat and inside of combat is that you've got all this kind of other stuff to do with kind of the combat obviously going on, but the amount of dialogue still carries on as if they were just in a normal conversation. But with the combat, that kind of needs to be there because the combat itself is reasonably repetitive. But that's because combat generally is fairly repetitive. The party that you're following isn't the strongest party in the world. They don't have amazing superpowers. So when they're going out and fighting things, they're fighting reasonably weak things over and over and over again. And in terms of the actual kind of RPG kind of stuff you get, there's none of that because this is right at the start. These are completely basic characters who aren't really overpowered like in some other books. So each of them have just got the normal way of fighting. There's no special fancy moves. And this leads me back to what I said at the start about there not being a lot of RPG elements in the book. So even though this series does have a kind of isekai tag on it, in reality it's just a fantasy book, but instead of following characters which have been brought up in this fantasy world, you've got some characters which have just been plopped in. So overall, Grimgar Fancy and Ash Volume 1 at least, I wasn't expecting what I read. Overall, I really went into this book expecting a lot more RPG and game-like things going on, but in reality this book only has a small amount of those. And I think it's very much a nice change, so this really, even though it has an isekai tag on it, and that is really what is happening, in reality, that's not at all what this is. It is just a fantasy book. The difference here being is that you're not expected to know about the world, so everything is explained to the reader and the party. This book is all dialogue. There is not a lot of detail in the surrounding setting and where you're going. Everything is about the characters talking and the internal dialogue of Haruhiro. All the conversations they have and all this internal dialogue is always complaining about something, and it's all very negative. There is very little positivity in this book. This all being said, every single character you come across is incredibly unique. They have their own story to tell and they have their own attitude about being in this world. So if you're thinking about reading this book for the kind of action, the RPG elements, then I think again, this book is heavily about character conflict, conversation, and I'd almost go ahead and say drama. As always, thanks for listening, and I have actually read the rest of the books in this series of Grimgar, Fancy and Ash, so those books I will be reviewing next alongside a couple of other August releases. So if you like what I'm doing here, consider subscribing, and once again, thanks for listening.